Today we're going to show you how to change the transmission on your washer. And even though we're going to use a lot of tools, it's still an easy job. What you will require is a number 2 Phillips screwdriver and a large flat blade screwdriver. And you'll either need a 1/4 inch or 5/16 nut driver. You'll need a 7/16 socket and a 1/2 inch socket with an extension and a ratchet. You'll need a pair of channel lock pliers, a large hammer, and you'll also need a tub nut spanner wrench as well. So you may need to borrow that from a local appliance company, or you can purchase it online. Let me show you how we do it. Now, to do this repair, we will need to have the washer where we can get at all sides of it. So disconnect the power and the water supply hoses, and then move it out into the center of the floor where we can do the repair. Our first step will be to remove the cabinet, and to do that we need to tilt the console back and access 2 clips that hold the cabinet to the top. In some models there will be 2 Phillips screws exposed in the lower corners of the end caps. Other models will require you to remove the end cap. They typically just lift up at the back and then carefully pull it forward, unhinge it from the bottom, and that will expose the screw. Do the same on both sides. Now once you remove those 2 screws, you can pull forward on the bottom of the console and then rotate it up and back. And that will give us access to the 2 retaining clips that hold the back to the top, as well as the harness connector for the lid switch. So we're just going to depress the locking tab on that and unplug it. Then with a flat blade screwdriver, we'll go down into the rectangular opening at the front of those clips and just take the tension off them and remove them. Now at this point the back panel will be freestanding and it will hold itself. So we're going to take the cabinet and just tilt it forward. We need to lift it up over the water injector. Then we can just grasp that complete cabinet and top and lift it off the base frame, and we'll set it aside. Now to remove the agitator, if your model has a fabric softener dispenser on the top, you need to depress the little tabs on the side of it, give it a 1/4 turn counterclockwise and lift that off. If it just has a cap on it, you take a flat blade screwdriver and just gently go in under the edge and pry that off. And next we'll need to remove the 7/16 bolt that secures that agitator to the top of the shaft. So with an extension, a socket and a ratchet, we're going to remove that. You will need to hold the base of that agitator from turning until you've freed the bolt up. And then just reach into the tub, grasp the outer skirt of that agitator and pull straight up and lift it off the agitator shaft. Now some models will have this agitator clip on the shaft. You just rotate that spring clip and remove that. And then this rectangular plastic washer can be lifted off next. We'll also need to remove the tub nut. So using the spanner wrench, I'm going to position that on that tub nut, and then with a heavy hammer we're just going to give that a few taps to break that free. Remove the nut. And then we'll also need to spread this dry block apart a bit. That will allow the agitator shaft on that transmission to pull down through it easier. So with a large flat blade screwdriver, we're just going to go into that opening and just tap that with a hammer enough to spread that apart. Now we've tilted the washer up here to give you a better view of the disassembly procedure here. And our first step will be to remove the pump and then the motor, and that will give us access to the transmission. Before we do that, we have a splash shield just above the pump here that has a rather sharp edge on it. So we suggest that you take a little bit of duct tape and just put that over that edge to protect your hands, or wear protective gloves. Now next, we're going to remove these 2 clips that hold the pump to the motor. So with a flat blade screwdriver, we're just going to go in under the edge of those and pry them up. And then you can rotate those 90 degrees And they have a little T-hook on the end of them that fits into a slot in the front of the motor. We'll set those aside. Then we can lift the pump away from the motor. The motor has a double flat shaft on it that mates up with the impeller in the pump. So we just push the pump out of the way, and if you need to, just release the little tab that holds the drain hose to the leg of the base frame, and then tuck that back out of the way. Now, the motor is held to the motor mount with two more retaining straps, and they have a couple of screws in them that may be either 1/4 inch or 5/16, and some of them actually have a Phillips head on them. So remove those two screws. And these screws are here just for shipping purposes only, so they don't need to be reinstalled. Once the screws are off, we'll take our flat blade screwdriver. We're just going to pry that clip loose, and again we'll give it a little 1/4 turn and remove it. Now, before we remove the last clip, we'll want to disconnect the wire harness to the motor, lift up on the locking tab and pull that harness away. And some models will have a separate wire that attaches to a terminal inside here, so we need to remove that as well. And then when we can support that motor with one hand, we'll just pop that top clip off, and then just tilt the motor forward. So we can reach in and remove the clip. And then you can pull the motor straight off the transmission housing. And it will come with the coupler typically still attached to it. And we also have some rubber mounting bushings at the back, and they may stay with the motor or they may stay on the motor mount. Now, next we're going to remove the wire harness clip that attaches to the base of the transmission. So just depress that plastic tab and pull it down and tuck that out of the way. With the motor removed, we'll next remove the two 1/2 inch bolts that secure the motor mount to the transmission. You may have noticed that there are 4 rubber mounts for the motor to that motor bracket, and sometimes they stay on the motor and sometimes they'll stay on the motor mounting bracket. Just make sure that we don't misplace them. So finish removing the 2 bolts, and we'll set that motor mount aside. You can also take note that the rubber portion of the drive coupling may have stayed with the motor or it may have stayed with the transmission. We want to make sure that we remove it from the old transmission because we will need to reuse it. The next, we'll remove the 3 1/2 inch bolts that secure the transmission. And we've also put a little piece of cardboard under here to protect against any potential oil leak as we remove that. So just loosen those bolts. Now, you will need to support that transmission as you remove the last bolt. Just the weight of it will allow it to slide out of the housing. And then carefully pull that completely out of the spin tube. And now we can set that transmission on a suitable work surface where we can take the clutch off the existing transmission and install it on the new one. Now, with the transmission out where we can access it, we're next going to slide this thrush washer all the way up the agitator shaft and set that aside. And we're next going to remove this large E-ring. So with a flat blade screwdriver, just pry that away. Now, to aid in lifting that clutch off of there, we suggest that you remove that little retaining spring that wraps around the center of it. So we're just going to push that in and release it. That spring has an end that projects into that hole in the clutch assembly. It just makes it easier to slide the clutch off if we remove that spring first. So we'll slide that all the way off. And this plastic bracket, if it didn't come with it, needs to be snapped into the bottom of that clutch assembly. Now we can discard the old transmission. Now, when installing the new transmission, you'll note that there should be a label on here to clear this breathing hole on the top of the transmission. So just before we're ready to put that back in the machine, we'll want to just scrape that off There's usually an epoxy or painted finish across that. So either with a knife or the edge of a flat blade screwdriver, just clear that off. Now the new transmission comes with a new E-ring, so we're just going to slide that off first. And we'll install the clutch. Just slide it completely down into position. And next we'll install that retaining spring. So tuck the pointed end down into that hole first. And then we have to roll that spring in underneath those 4 tabs. You may find that the channel locks might be the best tool here. So just compress that spring enough that it will pop down into there. And you can use either pliers or the screwdriver, whichever works best for you. And once we've got the point of that spring down into that opening, we can take a flat blade screwdriver. While we're holding that spring in position, we're just going to carefully push that spring out over the tops of those tabs and let it drop down in behind. Make sure it's seated all the way around. Then we'll install the new E-ring, and there are 2 slots on the side of that agitator shaft, so locate those. And then using our channel lock pliers, we'll just push that into position. And then slide the thrush washer down on top of that. And it has a couple of projections on the bottom that will fit in that open slot on the E-ring. And now we're ready to put the assembly back in the washer. So we're just going to carefully lift that transmission up, and we'll slide the agitator shaft up through the basket drive and line up the bolts for the transmission. And just put a couple of those in finger tight to hold it in place. And now we'll take the ratchet and tighten all 3 of those bolts. Now next we can install the rubber coupling for the motor coupling. Next we'll put the motor mount back in position. And we'll secure it with the 2 bolts. And tighten those with our ratchet. And then we want to make sure that we have the motor mounts either on the motor or on the motor mount itself. And then next we'll want to line up the drive coupling on the motor to mate with the drive coupling on the transmission. And just get it as close as you can just by looking at it. And we'll tilt the motor up into position. And if it's seated fully on that motor mount, we know we have it lined up properly. You can then just, while supporting it, tilt it forward enough that we can take that motor mounting bracket, slide it into the groove on the motor mount itself, rotate it into position, and then snap it over the front of the motor. And that will hold that until we can install the bottom one and snap that one in place. And you can choose to reinstall the retaining screws on those motor mounting brackets, or you can leave them off. Next we'll pull the motor harness into position, and first we'll reattach that plastic clip onto the base of the transmission. Just push it up through the opening, pull the harness around and reconnect the wires. And make sure that the locking tab engages. And next we'll rotate the pump into position and line it up with the double-sided motor shaft. Now when the pump is fully seated on that motor shaft, the 4 legs of the pump will sit flush with the face of the motor. We can then install the retaining straps. Just insert them into that oval slot on the motor, clip them over the front of the pump, and we're now ready to stand the washer up and reinstall the agitator and the cabinet. Now that we have the washer standing back up again, we'll next reinstall the tub nut. So just carefully thread it on by hand until it comes up against the inner basket, and then using our spanner wrench, we'll tighten that up. Now if your model had the rectangular shaped plastic washer, just slide that down into position, making sure that the tab goes in where the opening is in the tub block, and the agitator clip, slide that down over the shaft and right down on top of that washer. Well, next we'll install the agitator. So we're simply going to center that over the agitator shaft, line up the spline, and push it down until it bottoms out. Then we'll take our 7/16 socket and tighten the retaining bolt. Now next, depending on the model, we'll either replace the agitator cap, or if your model has the fabric softener dispenser, we'll snap that onto the top of the agitator. We're now ready to reinstall the cabinet. Now when we reinstall the cabinet, we need to make sure that we align the tabs on the base, and there'll be 2 on the left side, 2 on the right side, on the front and at the back, that will mate up with slots in the bottom lip of the cabinet. That's what holds the cabinet in position against the base frame. And we also want to tuck the front lip of the cabinet underneath the cross member on that base frame. So we'll lift the lid up so that we can view down inside. We'll tuck that lip underneath first, line up those 2 front slots with the tabs, and then just carefully tilt the cabinet forward. We'll need to pull the back panel into position, get the water injector in underneath the main top, and then align the tabs at the rear, and just pull outward on that cabinet when it's fully pressed down to make sure that we have it locked onto the base. We'll next reinstall the clips that secure the back to the cabinet. So hook the short tab into the back panel first, and then press the clip down into the top of the cabinet. Next, remember to reconnect the harness for the lid switch and ensure that the locking tab engages. You can then rotate the console down into position, and we need to make sure that the tabs on the end caps fit into the slotted openings on the top. Pull those back into position, and then we'll reinstall the retaining screws. And next we'll reinstall the end caps. We'll make sure that we engage the tab on the bottom, ensure it's fully inserted. Carefully line up the 2 on the side and snap in the top one. Do the same on the opposite side. We're now ready to reconnect the fill hoses and drain hose, reconnect the power, and our repair is complete.